Okay, so thanks very much everyone for joining us. It's 3 minutes past. I suggest we get started. So our first speaker is Akim Al-mouksit, and the paper is called "Do Remittances Mitigate COVID-19 Employment Shocks on Food Insecurity? Evidence from Nigeria." So Akim, I'm going to stop sharing my screen there. And if you're able to share your screen, then we can get started. Thank you very much, Akim. Great to have you. Yeah, we can see your screen.
Can you hear? Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, and hear you well. Thanks, Akim.
Okay,
over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. And I'm happy to present Do Remittances Mitigate COVID-19 Employment Shock on Food Insecurity. So we are looking at this question in the context of Nigeria. So this is a joint work with Firmin Ivuji and another colleague, Geoffrey Couton. So there are two elements of motivation of this paper. The first one is the tremendous consequences of the COVID-19 shock itself and the mobility restrictions measures that have been put in place and that have caused that have put many pressure on household food insecurity. And in that regard, there are many evidence showing that this shock and this measures have worsened household food insecurity. And within this these consequences, there are more concerns about sub-Saharan Africa, especially because of the weak social protection in this region and the lack of financial inclusion. So
Akim, your audio is occasionally breaking up.
Yeah.
Would you mind trying without your video? Mahreen and Boban, is that happening
Okay.
to you as well? I hope it's not my end. Yeah, so without your video, I think your audio will be a bit clearer. It's mostly been fine so far, so do please keep going. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, is it fine? Okay, so I was saying that, sub-Saharan Africa people are very exposed because of this wake of social protection. They don't benefit. Most of them don't benefit from social protection, and they lack a lot of financial inclusion. So they don't have many alternatives to cope with this shock. And one alternative that they can use is remittances, private transfer between households. So, and there is literature about that showing that, during shock, not especially COVID-19, but during shock in general, remittances can allow the household to smooth their consumption. And there are two main mechanisms that are highlighted in the literature. The first one is that we call here an ex-post mechanism, which is when the shock happened, the household may receive remittances, and then it is an increase of the income, and then they can face the shock. But in this context in the particular context of COVID-19, this mechanism is unlikely to happen because the COVID-19 hit the destination country of migrants as well as the origin countries. So and there are many studies, including from World Bank, showing that remittances were expected to decrease, especially in Nigeria. But we have another mechanism which is we call here the ex-ante mechanism, and this is the mechanism that we are focusing in this paper. This ex-ante mechanism means that household before the shock happened, household may receive remittances that they can use part of them to invest in productive activities, savings, or to access credit, etc. So this is the mechanism that we are expecting that it may work, it may be at play during the COVID-19, and we are investigating this second mechanism here. And there is literature on that showing that remittances stimulate financial services like savings and credit, etc. So the main objective of this paper is to look at the mitigating role of remittances amid this COVID-19 employment shock, and focusing on this ex-ante mechanism. And the main findings that we find, we find two main results. The first one is that we show that remittances absorb entirely the shock, especially at the early stages of the shock. And second, we shed light on this ex-ante mechanism. We find that the mitigating effect of remittances is defined by accessing to capital like formal financial inclusion, livestock ownership, or rental earnings. So how do we do that? So we use mainly World Bank household surveys. We had 6 waves of surveys, 2 waves before the COVID-19 and 4 waves after. And we were able to construct 2 groups of households that are hit by the COVID-19, which is we call here our treatment household, and the control household that don't that are not hit by the COVID-19. So how do we measure this shock? So this is how we measure this shock. So basically, household that is shocked. Okay, it's here. When households say that if there is any member stop working before the COVID-19, no, excuse me. If any member of the household stop working during the COVID-19 because of like main restrictions of legal restrictions of the government, this household is considered like shocked. And if they don't stop working, they are considered like not shocked. This is our control group. And then remittances, we are looking at remittances received before the pandemic happened, you know, to having in mind, you know, the ex-ante mechanism that we want to put in place, but also for identification strategy, because, you know, during the COVID-19, current remittances may be affected by the shock also. So we consider past remittances before the pandemic. And food insecurity, which is our main variable of interest, is based on, it's a score based on 3 questions. You know, if the household had to skip a meal before they didn't have, because they didn't have enough money, for example, or they were run out of food because of lack of money, or, you know, this kind of questions. So let me get back to, so that is how we measure the main variable using here, and we specify. And we have the remittances, the past remittances. So our main variable of interest is the beta one, which is associated with the interaction between shock, the shock variable, and the remittances, receiving remittances.
Sorry, Akim, we're losing you a little bit. I got everything up until the description of beta 1, and then I think it's broken up since then. So it might be useful just to back up a little bit. Can you hear me? Will you try speaking again, Akim? I think keep going. I think the connection is like sometimes slightly dodgy, but I've caught nearly everything so far. But I can't currently hear you, actually. Is that true of the other panelists? Okay, Akim, I'm worried we've lost you. You're on mute currently, actually, so maybe if you unmute, then...
Rossa, I think his connection has dropped out, so...
Okay.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now, Akim.
Sorry, I don't know what happened, but yeah, so I was saying that the beta one is our main parameter of interest. Can you see the slide?
And now we can't see your side, so if you reshare your screen, then I think keep going. The audio does sound much better now. And yeah,
Sorry,
I guess
1 minute.
this is the risk of online conferences. This all happened to each of us over the last 2 years at some point, I think. So don't worry about it.
Okay, I think I'm
And
okay
now we
now.
can see your slides and we can hear you. Yeah.
Perfect. Sorry for that.
No
So yeah, I
worries.
was saying that beta one is our parameter of interest, and that capture, you know, the mitigating effect of remittances we are looking at in this paper, and our identification strategies based on, you know, mainly because we use past remittances, you know, and we run parallel trend hypothesis test to see if the fundamental parallel assumption is plausible, and we run also a lot of placebo tests and robustness tests. But I will come back to that if we have time, or if you have more questions. And then to shed light on the capital mechanism test, you know, we decompose our meeting by comparing, you know, household with having access to capital and receiving remittances, and comparing them with those with no capital and no remittances. So this parameter is going to, you know, to allow to test this capital mechanism test. So if it's negative, you know, that means that receiving remittances and having access to the capital, you know, is amplifying the mitigating effect of remittances. So this is our main results. So as you can see here, we run the regression, and we're looking at this is the impact of the shock over time, and then we have the mitigating effect here. So, and at the same time, you can see the plausibility of the parallel trend hypothesis here. You see that before the shock, you know, the treatment and the control group have the same trend, and after the shock, you know, the food insecurity increased significantly, and it's still significant over the time. And here you have it's mitigate the shock, but what is very interesting is it's significantly early and we do find that, you know, having access to the capital amplify the mitigating effect. So, quick conclusion: we can say that remittances are mitigating the negative consequences of COVID-19 employment shock, especially in the short run. You know, even before the government has the time, you know, to implement maybe public social transfer and so on. You know, this paper shows that remittances has a key role during this COVID-19 shock. And then we shed light on this capital mechanism, capital channel, which has received less attention, because people, when you think of remittances, people you know, have in mind the ex post mechanism. So, two policy implications. First, remittances are an important private element of social protection that we think are worth to consider. And second, remittances provided protection should be. We are not claiming that remittances is the solution, but we think that remittances should be considered as complementary of the existence social protection. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Akim. And yeah, I think we got most of that. So thanks a lot for the presentation. And thanks for sticking on time as well. So this is a good precedent to set with the first presentation. I'd just like to remind people as we switch. So Akim, if you stop sharing, and then Amrit, I think if you can start sharing, just remind people to submit any questions you have to the Q&A using the Q&A functionality. Great. Okay. So next up, yeah, great. I can see you sharing your screen. So next up we have Amrit Amirapu, who will be presenting on the effects of personalized information provision on access to emergency government benefits. So over to you, Amrit.
Yeah, we need to find a snappier title, I think, but we're still working on that. This is very much a work in progress, including the title. I expect everything to change. I think we may have put together a draft for the conference. So if you are reading the draft, which I realize is available online, yeah, keep in mind it's finished. It's not near finished. This is joint with my colleagues at Kent, Irma Klots-Proveras, Bansi Malde, Anirban Mitra, and Zaki Wahaj, and Debayan Bakrashi at IIT Kanpur. So, you know, I'm not going to say too much about the background of COVID. Obviously, there was a very large negative impact on economic activity from the pandemic, and the related control policies in India was certainly no exception. India is the context of our study. One of the things that the government did is it led to a rapid creation and a big expansion of existing social protection programs. And that's what we're going to study here. You know, social protection programs like this are used to alleviate suffering in response to all kinds of economic shocks. So COVID is just an example of that. The thing that we are going to be focusing on is the fact that there's very often a gap between what these measures are supposed to do and then the take up that actually occurs. So very often access to the benefits is quite less than what it's meant to do. And that might be due to corruption in the implementation of the schemes or complexity, a lack of understanding of what people are entitled to, or unclear communication, etc. So the particular research questions, the main research questions that we're tackling here are the following. Does providing personalized information on access to or eligibility for emergency government benefits improve knowledge of the benefits, uptake, and well-being? And as a kind of additional thing, we also look to see whether the delivery of personalized information is more effective when it's given to particular members, in particular male versus female household members. What we do is we implement a cluster RCT, which provides personalized information via mobile phones regarding what government benefits slum dwellers in Kanpur, a large Indian city, are eligible for. The information is provided by staff at IIT Kanpur, so it's coming from a kind of credible, well-respected source. And we're going to focus on 3 particular programs, although there was a large suite of government relief efforts that were put forth in when the pandemic struck. The 3 that we're going to be focusing on are these programs which provided in-kind food aid, cooking gas, and direct monetary transfer to women. What we do is we randomize the design. So some people get personalized information and some people don't. We also randomize the gender of who gets it. And we also look a little bit at within slum spillovers. So I'll say a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. And what we find basically is that this sort of light touch intervention in which we're just sort of sending SMS messages and giving a phone call has a very big impact on knowledge in a sort of surprising way, and a big impact on access and household well-being. I'll tell you, well, I guess it's really too short of a presentation to give you the preliminary finding, to give you the findings now. I'll get to them in a couple of minutes. I'm going to skip to the literature slide just to say that this obviously links with literature on providing information about government benefits. So I'm also not going to say much about the background regarding COVID in India, except to say that when the lockdown was imposed, this was an enormous economic shock. It's estimated that more than 120 million jobs were lost overnight, mostly informal sector jobs. And soon after that, the government announced emergency support. And then a few months later, there was kind of a gradual reopening of the economy, haltingly and in different measures in different places. The particular programs that we're going to be looking at are the following. The Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, PMGKY, which entitled ration card holders. So you had to hold a ration card. Most of the slum dwellers that we're looking at already do, but 90%. Entitled them to receive an additional amount of food grains, so wheat, lentils, and certain vulnerable members of the population also got an extra lump sum transfer of money the Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, PMUY, which entitled you to free monthly gas refills, liquid petroleum gas refills, and the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, which allowed women to receive an extra 500 rupees in their months, in their bank accounts for 3 months. So those are the 3 programs that we're looking at. What we do in the intervention is we have respondents called up, and they're sent SMS messages, 3 messages, which provides information on each of the 3 programs, and then we follow up with a phone call, in which a trained enumerator provides information on what those particular household members are eligible for based on the baseline survey. So from the baseline survey, we know the number of people in the household, the age and gender distribution, et cetera. And so we can tell them, for example, this is the type of message that we get. We say, look, in the baseline survey, you said that you're a beneficiary under this program. If that's true, then you're entitled to this amount of rice or wheat, and 1 kilogram of pulses. So that's the kind of meat of the intervention. The timeline is as follows. In September or October of 2020, we did the baseline survey, and we did the randomization and intervention in November, and then the end-line survey was in January and February of 21. This is where the study is taking place, in Kanpur, and this is about the study population. So from the slum census, which was done in July, we randomly chose 60 slums, and we sorted those into 20 different slums in which the male household member would be given the information, 20 different slums in which a female household member would be given the information, and 20 control slums. And from each of those slums, we randomly selected 1,200 households. We ended up surveying about 1,000 of them for the baseline survey and 983 for the end-line survey. The survey respondents were females, ages 18 to 62. And the only important part here is that you see that about 90% of them were eligible for the PMGKY, the grain distribution. Only about a quarter of them for the liquid natural gas, and about 56% for the bank account payments. And this is a population who suffered very significantly from the COVID crisis. About 88% reported having lost at least part of their income. This image just sort of illustrates the experiment design. We randomize slums into whether the male or female is given the information, or no one's given the information. And then the other thing that we do is, in each of these slums, we pick 25% of our respondents not to be given the information. And in that way, we try to measure within slum spillovers. If you're in a slum in which other people are giving information, but you yourself are not given information, is there some spillover information that we can try to capture? And that leads us to, this is the distribution of treated slums in the district. That leads us to our regression equation. So our regression equation is, we regress outcome Y in household I in slum J in time T, which is either baseline or end line, against 2 different treatment dummies for whether you're in a slum where the female or the male was given the information, and then a spillover dummy interacted with the treatment, which tells us whether you're one of those households which wasn't given information, but you were in a treated slum. And then the coefficients A to R are going to tell us about the potential spillover effects, hopefully. We include a couple of controls, which include, the household head of main activity, for which there was potentially some slight imbalance after randomization. And where possible, where we have information on the value of the outcome baseline, we include that as a control to improve power. Standard errors clustered at the slum level. Okay, so let me get to the results. The first thing is, we don't really find very much of an effect on knowledge at the extensive margin. So most households have pretty good knowledge about programs, especially those that they're eligible for. So 90% of people knew about the PMGKY. Makes sense, they're already enrolled in it. And giving this information doesn't change whether or not they're aware that the program exists for any of the programs. But we do see an effect on the intensive margin. Well, that is to say, we see an effect not on whether they know that they're eligible for such a program, but we see an effect on how much they're eligible for. So these are distributions at baseline and end line, which measure the gap between what households report being entitled for and how much they're actually entitled for. And what you see in the baseline is that in all the three treatment areas, including the control area, there's significant overestimation. Households significantly overestimate how much they're eligible for compared to what they actually are. And then in the end line, the control group, of course, hasn't changed their beliefs, but the treated groups, both those with the female and the male are treated, the gap goes to zero. So we are fixing their misperception in a downward way to correct the bias. So now, whereas before they thought that they were entitled to much more, they had more realistic expectations about what they're entitled for. So we're correcting their perceptions downward. These are the histograms for Jandan. This is a similar graph, not quite as striking, but quite similar for PMGKY. So again, for the most part, there is systematic overestimation with respect to how much people think they're entitled to in the grains. That's the same across all the three treatment groups. And then afterward, the control group still overestimates how much they're entitled to in terms of kilograms of grains, whereas that's fixed for the treated groups. This is a regression which shows the same thing. The outcome here, the outcome variable here, is the gap between what households think they're entitled to versus what they actually are entitled to for each of these programs. And what you see is that, looking at the control mean, there's a significant overestimation, which is corrected by these treatments. And so far, we haven't seen much difference in terms of the value of these coefficients between the males and the females. The p-value for that wall test is given in the penultimate row of the tables. For PMUY, there does seem to be a difference there. So now let's shift and look at not effects on knowledge, but effects on actual take-up and access. So here again, we don't find much of an effect on the extensive margin. Looking at the PMGKY, 90% of the program of the control households were already receiving something, and that isn't shifted much by the treatment. And that's a similar story for the other programs. But we do see an effect on the intensive margin. The amount that households are receiving of grain under the PMGKY program, that increases. Possibly more among households with females treated than male, but we see a positive effect in either way, in either direction. And so far, we're not seeing much in terms of spillover effects either in any of these tests.
Amrit, you have about 3 minutes, by the way. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Nothing very consistent anyway. So we see the big effect here. We see also an effect on the number of households that receive a benefit. Not as much for the petroleum gas or the Jandan bank accounts. And there are good reasons for why the effects are not as great for these ones, starting with the fact that enrollment in these programs is lower, but there are other reasons that I can talk about in the question and answer period. So in the last couple of minutes, let me tell you that households, so this intervention succeeds in increasing take-up, and that has a predictable effect on lowering food insecurity. It also lowers food expenses, which suggests that people are able to substitute away from purchasing food with the food in kind benefits that they're receiving. The treatments also have a big impact on mental health and life satisfaction and measures of financial satisfaction. These are subjective measures of well-being, using various indexes, which again, I can talk about more. So let me conclude in the last minute or so. So what we've done is we've given this very light touch intervention, extremely cheap and scalable. And what we've done is we have documented first significant misperceptions, so persistently overestimated perceptions about how much people are entitled to. And this intervention has reduced this overestimation. And yet at the same time, it's increased actual take-up from at least one of the programs, PMGKY. In so doing, it's lowered food insecurity, reduced the amount that households expend on food, and improved mental health and life satisfaction according to these subjective measures. We mostly find null effects for differences in providing this information by gender. There were some exceptions, and I talked about one of those. And this contrasts with some of the literature that has occurred so far to suggest that for this instance, there seems to be relatively frictionless information sharing between the households regarding these benefits. We also find, for the most part, null effects of information spillovers within the slums. So it doesn't seem like, if you're living in a slum in which other people are treated, you're not getting the benefit. This might have to do with the sparsity of the network. What we're trying to do now, the next steps are, we're trying to understand, exactly why it is that when you correct, misperceptions in a downward direction, take-up goes up. And we have certain hypotheses for this, but we certainly haven't nailed this down, and we're really not sure exactly what the answer is. And then we do have other outcomes that we're exploring now. In particular, we're trying to see how these treatments affect perceptions of households and government and other institutions, their voting intentions, and their perceptions of corruption. And we'd be very happy to take any questions that you have and comments in the end of the session. Thanks very much.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Amrit. And this is another one perfectly on time. Yeah, I am now going to turn to Mahreen. So Amrit, if you could unshare your screen, and then Mahreen, if you share yours. And in the meantime, please do keep submitting questions via the Q&A functionality, and I'll keep track of them for our two speakers so far. Great. Okay, so we're delighted to have Mahreen Mahmud, and she's going to be presenting on adapting to an aggregate shock, the impact of COVID-19 crisis on rural households. Mahreen, over to you. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Rossa, and thank you to all the organizers and attendees. This is joint work with Emma Riley, who's based at the University of Washington. I don't think, as Amrit said, I need to particularly introduce the COVID-19 shock to any audience, let alone this panel. But very briefly, we all know that 2 years ago, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, it resulted in lockdowns across the world, including in low and middle income countries. We also have quite robust evidence on the immediate negative impacts this had on a range of outcomes, particularly in reducing consumption and hence increasing hunger and overall diminishing people's income in low and middle income countries, also for the poor. So initially, there was hope that maybe the poor will be relatively insulated. We found out very soon this was not the case. We want to extend this, our scope, from the immediate effects to thinking now more about the short and medium term. The initial coping strategies, of course, are about liquidating assets or borrowing, but as more time passes, households have the opportunity to start thinking about diversifying their incomes or switching to other income sources. And we want to use the case of COVID-19 pandemic to understand how different types of rural households may adapt to an aggregate shock. And we do this by using multiple rounds of phone surveys that allow us to trace the impact on rural households in Uganda over a one-year period, so between March 2020 and March 2021. We utilize an in-person survey that happened just before the lockdown in March 2020, and a final round of survey a year later at the same point in the agricultural cycle. We also have survey rounds in between, but we think a particularly powerful thing here is that we do go back and measure at exactly the same point a year later, so we don't have to worry as much about seasonality. The other thing worth noting with this particular sample that we have is that this is a randomly selected representative sample of rural households. So there was no inclusion criteria to be part of the sample. And we collect a range of outcomes from these rural households on their economic outcomes as well as well-being, and we would be able to trace how these outcomes were affected as the lockdowns were imposed, and then when they were relaxed and then completely lifted within this one-year period. And so with this, we obviously are contributing to now the quite substantial literature on COVID-19, but we're going beyond the immediate impacts and looking at what can be thought of as more than an immediate impact a year after. But more importantly, we think with this paper, which is descriptive, of course, we are contributing to the broader literature that's interested in understanding how households respond to shocks, often using the case of droughts or other natural disasters. And we are looking at a different kind of shock to see how households cope with this. So before I go into the results, let me just very briefly give you some description of the setting for the sample. So Uganda had one of the strictest lockdowns in the world in March 2020 at the end of it, which slowly began to be relaxed and was almost entirely lifted, apart from school closures, by July 2020. But it's also worth noting that cases remain extremely low, especially during the study period. So any impacts that you see are actually of the lockdown being imposed rather than of direct illness or deaths being experienced. There were some lockdowns that happened after March 2021 as well, once again to cope with infections actually starting to spread in Uganda, but that's beyond our sample period. So we have about 700 randomly selected households from 64 villages. These are all part of a control group for a larger RCT that we're doing with our partner Raising the Village. So no treatment was administered in these control villages. These are quite remote poor villages, but from within these villages, then we draw a random sample. So as I said, no inclusion criteria. We did follow-up surveys every month between May and September 2020, and then a final survey round over the phone in March 2021. In the final survey round for our study, we reached about 558 of the original 689 households, or in other words, 81% follow-up rate, which we think is quite impressive for a phone follow-up. And more importantly, no individual or a characteristic predicts attrition, and they're obviously not also jointly predicting attrition. So we are quite comfortable in asserting that the impacts that you see are for a representative sample for these rural villages. Finally, all outcomes that I'm going to be talking about, or any values that I mention, are going to be in US dollars purchasing power parity terms. Now, as I alluded to earlier, we are interested in trying to unpack how different types of households respond to this particular kind of shock that they're experiencing. And we do this particularly because the COVID-19 pandemic obviously restricted economic activity in rural areas, which is how we are expecting these households to be impacted. And so we try to unbundle if particular kinds of households, which look very different from the rest of the sample, namely in our case, households that had a non-farm business pre-pandemic, how do they cope as compared to households that were entirely reliant on farm and casual labor income? And these business owning households were also the wealthier households in these villages. These are still very small businesses that they're running. They're like mostly in retail, or they're manufacturing some snacks or food, but they did have 3 times higher income and twice as large non-land assets as compared to households within these rural areas that did not own a business. And they were reliant on this business income because half of their total income was coming from these businesses. And the lockdown mandated nearly all kinds of businesses to completely shut down, while farming activity, of course, could continue. There were still issues with linkages with the market, but you could still continue to grow and sell in the local markets. What's important also is that nearly 50% of the businesses that were operating pre-pandemic were still shut in March 2021, even though there was no explicit prohibition on business operations. So they seem to be quite severely hit in the medium term from a lockdown that happened before. So which is why we think it's worth thinking about these households and how they will cope with the pandemic as distinct from households that are reliant mostly on farm income. And so the main descriptive analysis that I'm going to show you will take into account this heterogeneity that we are after. And so simple estimating equation where the follow-up dummy is for each round of survey, and it gives you the coefficient gives you the effect of each follow-up round as compared to the pre-pandemic March 2020 situation. And in addition to for the non-business households, and in addition to it, the gamma parameter gives you at each follow-up round what's happening to the business households, what is the heterogeneous impact on them. All the analysis that I will show you will be restricted to the sample of households that we were able to survey in March 2021. This is for ease of comparison, and we also think this is the right sample to use because that's the point at which we are exactly the same agricultural cycle point, and so that's the right comparison to make to the March 2020 situation, but our results remain the same even if we use an unbalanced panel. So let's turn to the first set of results. These are the main outcomes that we are looking at, and I'm just showing you as a first step the effects in a year later, split by non-business owning households and the heterogeneous effect on the business households. We have total income, which is just the monthly income these households make. This is scaled, obviously, to monthly income from all sources, including crops, businesses, casual wage, and any other sources. Then we have total non-land wealth. We also measure land, but that tends to be quite noisy and there's not a lot of movement. So we focus on total non-land wealth. And then we have one measure of well-being, which is a self-reported measure on a scale of 1 to 10 with the quality of their life. And what jumps out quite immediately, I'm sure, is that in the second row here, the households that did have a business at baseline are much worse hit as a result of the pandemic, even a year later, and even 6 months after all restrictions have been lifted. They have actually a 40% decline in their total monthly income on their baseline mean, which was obviously much higher than the non-business once this is given in the lower panel. Their non-land wealth is also depleted about 30% as compared to pre-pandemic. If you turn to the non-business holders, you actually see that by March 2021, there is no significant difference in their monthly income. And we think that this might be happening because we need to separate out poverty from vulnerability to shocks. And here, the business owners were the ones who were most vulnerable to the kind of aggregate shock that the COVID-19 pandemic was. The interdependence on the market made them more vulnerable. And what's obviously really concerning is that they've been unable to bounce back even when restrictions have been lifted. And I'll just unpack this a bit to think also about what the non-business owning households, how they have fared. And in order to do that, what now I'm going to show you are actually just the average values split by business owners and non-business owners. This might be a little hard to see, but the black lines are the mean values for each kind of income, and the gray ones are for the non-business owners. And if you focus in on the first panel, which are the crop sales, you'll see that even the business owners pre-pandemic were earning quite a bit of income from crop sales. So it's not like they were just entirely reliant on businesses. The only thing is that they also had another major source of income that the non-business owner households did not. And so what you see is that there was a decline initially, but this is also part of the agricultural cycle. But by the same point in March 2021, as compared to March 20, you see that crop sales have bounced. If anything, for the non-business owners, they're actually higher. In terms of wage income, this is mostly casual labor at other people's farms. These continue to be depressed. So this is in part because of them supplying less labor, but also because wages are depressed in this area. And this also saw a big sharp decline in May 2020, continues to be depressed. But if you notice that the non-business owners have managed to compensate for some of this loss that they experienced from higher crop sales. However, for business profits, if you look at the panel C, the sharp drop in May 2020, there's a slight recovery, but these are still significantly depressed as compared to a year before. And this is where the gap for the business owning households is coming, which they've been unable to compensate for via other sources. And so just to summarize our results on income, we do see a greater reliance on farming activities. Even when we look at the labor that's being supplied by these households, we do see that they are supplying more labor towards farm activities, and they are actually managing higher crop yields in March 2021 as compared to March 2020. It's also worth mentioning it was a better season, so we can't just attribute it to more labor being employed in farm activities, but we do see a 20 percentage points more likelihood of households selling crops to market, which is raising crop income. And this is enough for non-business owning households to be on average at the same level as what they were in March 2020. And I forgot to mention here that this also then means that if you look at life satisfaction in the last column, they're not looking any different from March 2020, while not surprisingly for the business owning households, there's a significant drop in their own perception of their quality of life. And this seems to be because they've been unable to grow back their businesses and they don't have other sources of income to compensate for the large decline they've seen.
Mahreen, you have about 3 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, okay. I'll briefly mention non-land wealth. Non-business owners have also seen a decline overall, but the business owning households have seen a sharper decline in the non-land wealth. Of course, the non-business owning households, as you saw, also saw a depressed casual labor income and crop sales initially. So that has translated into some liquidation of their assets. But for business owning households, this is really dramatic. They've seen a 45% fall in their savings. Their borrowing is 15 times higher as compared to pre-pandemic levels. And while we can't unpack and precisely point to productive versus unproductive assets, we do get some sense that it's more the productive assets like large items, like electrical items and motorbikes and so on, that the business owning households have had to sell to cope with the pandemic. And this may actually also hint at why they're unable to start their businesses again, and they continue to be shut. Finally, we look at, to complete the picture on welfare in terms of expenditures in these households, what we see is that food expenditures also are sharply down, but it's worth mentioning here that this is both food consumed from that is bought from the market and from own production. And some of what is going on, I'll talk about it in the next slide. The picture is not as bad as it looks here, because we don't see an increase in hunger by March 2021 as compared to March 20. But what's noticing is that non-food expenditure did see some decline, but they seem to have bounced back. So it's really food expenditures where we're seeing still a decline. But what we when we unpack this, we see that there's actually a shift in the composition of what they're spending on. So they're actually going from high cost foods like meat and vegetable to spending more on staples and pulses. There's also been a decline in these areas in prices of staple food because everybody's producing it and selling it in the local markets. So it seems like they're not as hungry as before, but there may be concerns about the level of nutrition that they're able to get. We do not have detailed data on that, but we are getting a sense that this depressed incomes are translating into low quality food being consumed. And very briefly, because I'm almost running out of time, there may be concerns obviously about threats to identification because of seasonal fluctuations, or that we obviously try to address by looking at the survey round exactly 1 year later. But we also go back to the Ugandan National Panel survey from 2015, and we are also able to map out how incomes and consumption fluctuate through the year, and some of the fluctuations that we see are much sharper than fluctuations in a usual year that were seen before. We also asked respondents directly about some of these outcomes and some of the changes that we're seeing, and their responses are in line with what we're seeing in the data as well, that they have in fact closed their businesses due to the pandemic. They're also reporting having to reduce spending, having to work more, and taking out more loans. So they're cognizant of the changes that they're having to make, which we're also then seeing in patterns of data. So we don't think this is just about natural fluctuations through the year. And so just to summarize, if we see mixed success of households in coping with a large aggregate shock. If you focus in on the non-business owning households who are more aligned on farm income, they seem to be doing relatively all right. Their assets are still, non-land wealth is still down, but they seem to have bounced back in terms of the income that they're earning. However, households with a business, they are still severely hit. They were the more well-off households. They're seems like coping by liquidating assets, but for how much longer is a big question mark. How they're going to pay back their large loans that they've accumulated is of concern as well. And so as we move forward and think about the next steps, this is something worth considering in terms of the employment opportunities that these businesses generated, but also for these households themselves to come out of the COVID-19 shock. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Mahreen. Okay, so yeah, please do submit any questions you have for Mahreen or anyone else using the Q&A function. And Boban, let's hand over to you. So as you share your screen, I'll introduce you. So we're delighted to have Boban Paul, and he's going to present on COVID-19, poverty and social safety net response in Zambia. So over to you, Boban, and we can see your screen fine.
Okay, great. Okay, I wasn't unmuted, so now I am. Thanks a lot again for the opportunity, and apologies if I didn't follow a slide format, but let's go on. So, as I kind of talk about this work and present the analysis, I do want to kind of also say that, it's a bit of presenting the analysis itself, but also the approach of kind of engaging with government. And this is work that we did pre, the response to inform the government's response to COVID-19. So, a lot of the work is based on simulations, and, were done under time constraints, and therefore, like within two months or 3 months, we had to kind of produce all this and get to what are some of the potential responses and then simulate that out. So as I said, the objective of the study was to simulate the impact of COVID-19 on rural and urban households, and simulate social protection responses to inform the government's efforts to mitigate the effect of COVID-19, but with a broader goal of alleviating chronic poverty in the country. And you'll see why I say that as we kind of go into these slides. Just a bit of background, going into 2020 when COVID happened, Zambia was already not doing fairly well in terms of economic growth. So between 2010 and 2015, Zambia's GDP per capita grew at about 2% on average. And that had decelerated by the time we got to 2019. At the same time, public debt stock had increased quite substantially, again, in that time period. And discretionary spending had already reduced from being 33% of the total expenditure to about 12%. And these have implications for how you respond, right? Because you need to kind of have enough financial capability to kind of respond. And I'll talk about some of this as well. So in terms of background, again, in terms of what kind of instruments exist to have a response, and I'm focusing a lot more on social protection. Of course, there are other kind of responses that the government did have in health and some of the firm level work that they have done. But then for social protection itself, social cash transfer program, which was launched in 2014, is and has since been the largest flagship cash transfer program of the social assistance program of the government. We did some analysis where we find that this is well targeted to the extreme poor, and there have been studies in the past, up to 2016, where we find that this program has had a big impact on the consumption and income of households that received it. But as I said, because of fiscal pressures, the program was not getting the kind of financing it had been getting before that. And so you see that, while the planned caseload was around 632,000 households by 2019, only about 96,000 households worth of money was actually being dispersed by the Ministry of Finance. And so the program was basically, there, but not really functioning at full capacity. In terms of what data we had to do the analysis that we did, so we had the Living Conditions Measurement Survey done in 2015. We then, there was also the LFS survey that was a little more recent, but then it did not have consumption module to then kind of simulate the impact of the. Now, the other thing that we used was the IMF sectoral GDP growth estimates for 2015 to 2019, and then for 2020, their projections for 2020. And lastly, administrative data at the district level on caseloads for the SCT, for the cash transfer program, because there was no identifier within the living conditions measurement survey to identify who would get a cash transfer and who wouldn't, to then kind of, simulate out what would the impact of a response be. These are just some of the other approaches that, countries around that time have done lots of different things, as, and what we've kind of generally observed is that the more developed countries have had more real-time data available, and so they've done more nuanced analysis. Whereas, more on the developing countryside, where data is either outdated or not available at that time, or isn't perfect enough, there were more kind of assumptions and micro simulations undertaken, and that's kind of the route that we went with as well. So, this just to kind of present the methodology of it, right? So we started off with, looking at the aggregate consumption at the household level in 2015, assumed full pass-through of incomes to consumption, and extrapolated that from 2015 to 2019 using sectoral GDP per capita growth rate data from the IMF for up to 2019 and then 2020. And what we did was here we identified the household and which sector they were employed in. and kind of used the full pass through of how much ever the GDP growth for that sector would be, and then kind of get that to the consumption. Highly imperfect, and I can kind of say that right away. But again, given the time that we had then, this is kind of what we what we could do at that point. We held prices constant because it was getting a bit more complicated, kind of figuring out how prices were changing, and it was not clear how prices would change in 2020. This analysis was done, maybe 2 or 3 months right after the pandemic, on the onset of the pandemic. To simulate responses on safety net, again, we basically used the criteria for the social cash transfer, the targeting criteria for social cash transfer, to then simulate out what would, looking at household characteristics in the LCMS 2015, we identified households that would potentially receive the benefit, and then kind of, distributed amongst people, depending on amongst these households, but capping the total at the district level to match the administrative data caseloads that we had. And we used 3 different assumptions, perfect targeting, where the bottommost in that district would get cash transfer first and then move up. Random, where anybody could get it, and then the mixed targeting method. And here I present the analysis for the mixed targeting method. And then we then kind of use that to then see what's the impact on poverty, poverty rate, poverty gap, and inequality. I don't present all of this here. I just present poverty rate, just to give you a sense of where we went. So what we find in between 2015 and 2019, we looked at the basically the average change in household consumption between 2015 and 2019. And across the across the income distribution, and what we find is that it's the poorest households that have been most affected, or like negatively affected. Their incomes were actually reducing over time, and it's driven largely by the recurrent droughts that happened in 2016. Then in 2018 there was another drought. 2019-20 though was very different, and it kind of reflects, and it was actually great to kind of see Mahreen's work, because it validates this to some extent, right? Where we find that at least in the major term, and this again analysis is very right after the pandemic, right? So we find that it's the better off that were doing worse than that were most affected by the pandemic, and it's to do with the lockdowns, and the less of whoever were poorer before that were affected, but to a lesser extent. But on average, what you do still find is the poor kind of went into the pandemic with having already depleted a lot of the resilience through savings or assets because of these droughts, and so on average you find that they still were actually much worse off compared to the better off between 2015 and 2019. And just some macro estimates where we find poverty increased by around 1.4 percentage points between 2015 and 19, and by 1.7 percentage point in just 1 year, driven to a large extent by urban poverty, as you can see. It went 21.6% to 24.9% in 2020. Now, in terms of simulating the social cash transfer program itself, what we assumed is, one, that the government would finance, the whole cash transfer, because what we found was, in many countries where you did have some kind of safety net, there was already a kind of first line of defense against, COVID and kind of the negative impacts of that. In Zambia, that was missing because of fiscal constraints. And so we did 2 different simulations. One to look at the cash transfer amount. We kept it constant between, and at the revised rate in 2017, so it was around 90 kwacha per month per household. It's about $7 basically, and if you were a disabled headed household, it would be around 180 kwacha. And then we kind of did another kind of simulation where we adjusted it for inflation between 2017 and 2020 to see what would that be. Again, we held this, so what we found overall was, just the status quo SCT, which was the first scenario, kind of scaling up the cash transfer program would itself lead to a drop of about 4.4 percentage points. And the enhanced social cash transfer program, which is the second simulation, would drop poverty rate by around 6 percentage points from 58%, which was what was expected. And this was kind of followed by a few months of just deliberation and conversations with the government, and they finally decided that they would, finance the full caseload of cash transfers and actually scale it up even further. So there was a request from the government for additional financing from the World Bank in the tune, in an amount of $105 million US dollars to cover basically the revised amount of cash transfers for 18 months for the existing caseload, which was around 600 to 700,000 households, and then for another 6 months for an additional 300,000 households. And this one, and so that the total caseload by mid this year would be around 1 million households, which represents 50% of the Zambian poor households. The idea is that from June 2022, the government would start financing payments to the additional caseload of households that do get that receive the benefit. And just to conclude there, just key takeaways and implications, and we kind of beyond kind of the use of this for to kind of inform the government's rollout of cash transfers, I think COVID-19 kind of gave us all an opportunity to know what climate shocks could look like, right? And even if we don't kind of live in places where we are affected by it immediately. But basically, while COVID-19 was unprecedented, climate shocks are very prominent, and they come unannounced. And while robust and extensive data is always preferred, I think even the use of creative use of existing data, however basic it might be, might still kind of give us a better better understanding of how to respond to some of these shocks. Second, institutional collaborations are critical. So in this case, the collaboration between the World Bank, IMF, and government to make all of this data kind of available, which wasn't always, isn't always easy, right? It's not always easy to get district level caseload data from government unless you've kind of built a relationship with them over time. But then these institutional collaborations are very important, and it would help kind of doing more of such analysis going forward and refining it. And then broader policy implications. Planning for shock responsiveness should include more of such collaborations and synergies. With universities, with local universities, NGOs, research organizations, even the private sector. And we can draw on some of the work that were done, by Raj Chetty, for example, who used credit card data to kind of estimate what the impact of COVID was. And then, kind of doing future research to figure out, if these methods actually were useful, right? And whether these methods do actually work, whether these quick and dirty methods, how efficient it is, and how can we kind of improve on it going forward, because you can't really assume that this is the best way forward, right? And you kind of do this every time. So each time we do it, we should learn from that, and then kind of inform what we do in the next stage. So that's it from me. And back to you, Rossa. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Boban. And you were perfectly on time. I didn't give you a 3-minute warning because it seemed like you were wrapping up already. Great. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for all the presentations. So we have about 20 minutes for questions. We have 1 or 2 that have come in, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to also just go through the presentations in order see if there's any questions for people. And then if not, we can kind of either cycle back through, or it's possible because these papers are so interconnected that there's a question that might be relevant for multiple papers or all of you at once. So first, Akim, if you're there, I had a question. I wanted to ask you to expand on the mechanism. So my understanding is that these remittances kind of ex ante kind of strengthen the financial resilience of households. Is that right? And I kind of wanted you to say a bit more about what you think was happening to help households cope with the shock.
Yeah, sure. So what I think is happening, remittances received before the pandemic reinforce like savings for the household, and some household, you know, may use these remittances to productive activities. They may use to for example, they may use rental earnings, and they can also use it to buy how can I say, poultry, or, you know, cows, something like that. And then when the shock happens, you know, they will be that help them to reinforce their asset and their financial.
Akim, we're losing you a little bit again. Do you mind trying without your video again?
Asset, you know, when the shock.
Sorry about this.
Okay, sorry for that.
I think we heard most of that.
Yes,
so you're saying they invest in livestock beforehand. So maybe I'll ask a follow-up, which will be possibly where you're going. So these households still are hit negatively by the shock, but they have more of a buffer. Is that the main takeaway, or do you think that they're able to have less of an overall shock?
Yeah, they are able to, in the short run, they're able to cope the whole shock. I mean, those receiving remittances, you know, the mitigating effect, you know, offset the shock, the adverse shock completely in the short run. But this mitigating effort is getting less and less over time. Remittances may protect the household only at the short time, but it's not, as the savings is not, as the stock of savings is not as large as you know, they can stand over time. So it's we see the mitigating effect is effective only at in the short run.
Great, thanks a lot, Akim.
Can I add something to this?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please.
So, I mean, I think this discussion is interesting, and I think it connects with some of what was coming out of Mahreen's work. So if you think of remittances as complementary to productive capital, and if productive capital is what particularly takes a hit during the COVID pandemic, which is what, you know, we were getting from Mahreen's work, then the benefit of remittances for cushioning shock should be even greater in, you know, those types of shocks like climate shocks that Boban was talking about, in which you don't have this disruption to business activity. So the fact that remittances are effective here, it may be kind of underplaying their value for other kinds of shocks. To the extent that you think that remittances are complementary with you know, productive investments. Does that make sense?
Complementary with the,
if you're using remittances as an input to business activities.
Yep.
Then that should be even more beneficial to helping the household weather shocks when business activities are not also being hit by the shock, which is what was happening in COVID. So in a sense, if you were to extrapolate to a different shock, the benefit might be greater.
different shock
Yeah, like
beside the
weather drought or
COVID-19. It's a good point. We didn't think about that, but it's a good point. I take a note.
Thanks Akim, and thanks Amrit for the follow-up. So Mahreen, I think you had a question on Amrit's presentation. Did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I just wanted to understand better how does the intensive margin actually work, which is where you're finding effects. So if somebody has good knowledge of what they're actually eligible for, how does that play into what they actually get? Is this so? Because initially I was trying to tell myself a story that the phone call, given that everybody knows about eligibility, so the margin is maybe that they think that the phone call means that they're actually now, it's their turn, come and get it, which is why it's not spilling over and so on. But from what I could see, that's not what's happening because there's no extensive margin effect. So it's really happening on what they're able to get out when they, I don't actually understand the mechanism of how they actually approach that. So that would be helpful to know. Also because I feel like they already thought that they were eligible for more. So it's not like they're asking for less earlier, but is it like having precise information that matters somehow that communicates to the other side that you should get it? Or
yeah, I would love to know the answers to these questions as well. I have some hypotheses. So you know, we've talked about this a little bit. I mean, my favorite hypotheses are as follows. So firstly, I think it's worth noting that we don't see any effects on the Jandan. And I think that's because that's an automatic transfer by the government. It's a fixed amount. There's very little room on the intensive margin to benefit. For the PMGKY, for the food grains, you have to go to the ration shop to pick it up. And then what I think is relevant here is that, or I think it could help to write down a model about this, in which there's some kind of bargaining, perhaps even corruption that goes on in the ration shop. And it's beneficial to know not only what you're entitled to, but it may also be relevant the strength that you have, the conviction that you have, that you know that it's right. So it could be that you think that you're entitled to 10 kilograms, but you're not really sure, and so it's difficult for you to. But if you get a text message from the IoT guys and it's on your phone, then maybe you can show the guy in the ration shop and say, hey, or the text message has a link to a website and a phone number. And if you can find that information out, you can say, hey, this is, it can give you more confidence to, and that may improve your bargaining power. So I guess what we have in our head is some sort of bargaining game, where there's asymmetric information, and this is strengthening bargaining power by improving the quality of information people hold, even if it's lowering the quantity that you believe you're eligible for. That's a story I have in my head. I don't know how to prove that.
no, I think that's plausible, but some even qualitative work to try to see how this happens on the ground, and doing some open-ended interviews with people in all sorts of groups might help unpack the story. That is this really their experience, that when they go there and they quote this high amount that they think is their estimate, what is the reaction that they get? And also maybe think a little about what the incentives for corruption are from the other side. Is it that they're able to pocket the difference if they don't give it to the person because they don't have complete information, or is it just like casual corruption in some sense? I can also imagine that totally in a South Asian context, being like, oh, no, this is not how much you have, it's actually much less. So I think I totally can see some open-ended qualitative work to support this to build the model, but otherwise it does sound possible. Thank you.
I agree that I think that should be worth doing. And I also would be particularly interested in hearing whether you or anybody else who's listening in the audience, if they have other hypotheses for what might be driving this. In fact, I would love to hear them, because it's a hunch. I think qualitative work would be useful, but if we have a clear idea of other hypotheses, and we can build that into the qualitative work to kind of see what we can find. So do let me know. Thanks a lot.
I was actually going to ask a similar question. I did not think about the bargaining, and the bargaining could be extremely interesting. Like if you could uncover that through qualitative work or something, that sounds like a super interesting story. But I was thinking about just uncertainty. So you have this point estimate of how much they think they're eligible to, but presumably they're not very confident. So this is very similar to your story. But I was thinking about this in terms of kind of the expected utility they get from an uncertain claim or something, but then I think that would have an effect on the extensive margin as to whether they claim or not. So maybe that story is not right, and maybe the one you're thinking of makes more sense. yeah, I can't think of anything better, but it does seem like their initial guess is just a guess, right? And then you give them this information, and they're a lot more certain about it, and it might allow them to claim more accurately.
I want to comment on this one because I don't know if there's any influence of the adequacy of what they receive, right? They expect it to be whatever, $400, they get 20, and they're like, yeah, I don't care. But then they get a message saying, please go get your money. And, you know, they feel like, oh, it's, you know, the government's asking me to go get the money, so I'll go and get it. You know, it's more like, but it really, you know, is such a small amount that, you know, compared to what they were expecting, that they basically would not have gone otherwise. I don't know, just a thought.
But see, so again, I think if that were the case, you would expect to see an effect in the extensive margin, right? So people are going to collect the rations. They're just not coming away with as much. They're getting an extra kilogram of grains when they go. So if your story was going on, then I would expect them. It's the difference between staying home and taking the effort to go get what you're owed, right? But that would be an effect on the extensive margin.
Can I just one more thought, that if you're able to precisely see how much everybody's getting in the control group, are you also able to see if it's just like a constant amount? So maybe the shopkeepers are just like defaulting to, oh, everybody X, here you go, without having to like really look into how much, or is there variation in that? That might also show that, is it bargaining, or is it just simply that they have fixed some low amount and that's what they're just giving everybody, and because people don't know really what they should be getting, they come back with it.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I know that the average is lower. So people on average, controlled households are getting less than they're owed. I don't know what the distribution looks like. I imagine that within that there are some households which are getting exactly what they're owed, and some who are getting less. So what I would learn, let's say it was sort of bimodal, where some people are getting everything and some people are getting nothing, or what can we learn from that, do you think?
I was thinking more not just even about how much they're eligible for, but rather that the shopkeepers have in their mind that everybody who comes and says I am on this program should be given 1 kg, and that's it. So I was just thinking that maybe there's not so if you see like peaks at like some, you know, round numbers or something, that's right. Just they're just defaulting to it, and they're busy, and so they don't want to actually figure out how much. I don't know at which end they have to do it. They probably have to go through the record and see, oh, they were actually, and so they don't want to invest that time. Right. So I was just thinking about an alternative story to bargaining, that maybe it's this. So, but that you could rule out by looking at the control data to see how much variation you're seeing.
That's a great idea. Thank you. I think that's worth doing, to understand something about the behavior of the ration shop keepers in the absence of the treatment. Thanks. I'll do that.
Amrit, just before we move on to the other questions, I had one other question about like the information spillovers that you're trying to test for.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could test, so you have 25% of your sample you assign not to get treatment, but then are in a treatment cluster. And I was wondering if you can test whether those people are more likely to have an effect if there's a greater density of treated people in their area, or if there's like less heterogeneity in the program that they're eligible for, or something like that. So maybe I'm just pushing you to keep searching or something.
I understand. I think I understand where you're going. So one of the reasons why we think there might not be spillovers is because the information has a degree of personalization to it. And so I think what I hear from you is that you're saying if there's variation in the degree of how transferable this information is across households, then maybe you expect that the information transfers better in that situation. Exactly. That is an interesting idea. That's an interesting idea. So I think, you know, you could look at different slums and see what is the variation of populations of household sizes, and that might do it. That's interesting. I think that's worth taking a look at. Thank you.
Yeah, cool. Okay, great. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on. Mahreen, I had a couple of questions for you. So first, so it seems that half the businesses close, right? And then half of them are still open in March 2021. So my first question is like, are those businesses doing better off? So conditional on surviving, it seems like they should have a greater market now. And I don't know, can you see that in the data at all?
That's a good question. I don't think we've looked at conditional on actually operating. So that's an interesting thing to look at. That are they capturing some or is it just depressed demand in general? So I think that will unpack help us, because our hypothesis was that there's depressed demand, which is why. But that's very interesting to think about.
Yeah, that was exactly my second question, because if I mean, it also depends at the I presume there's some depressed demand, but it depends on the extent to which there's suppressed demand versus there's just like consolidation, and maybe the surviving firms are doing better off. I can't remember the magnitudes, but it seemed like your effect sizes were less than 50%. So like a very naive thing would say, well, there's 50% fewer businesses, but the total amount of demand has reduced by less than 50%. So the surviving ones might be better off. So that might be interesting. And then, yeah, my second question was about this suppressed demand story and like what the correct policy response is. It seems like they're just stuck in a bad equilibrium now, and the right thing is to have a stimulus, even if we think the pandemic is over, is to kind of explain to policymakers, well, the epidemic might be kind of quote unquote over, but we're now stuck in this bad equilibrium that we need to get people out of. Otherwise, we're going to have these extremely long-running effects. And this seems like a really important point for policymakers to get hold of if it's true, but it seems like there's evidence across the papers in this session that it is. Yeah,
I agree. I think some support to pay off loans to begin with. I think we have to be careful, because if you give them cash grants at this stage, even if they're capital grants, that might go towards their loans being paid off. So being careful about that, and then actually spurring these enterprises again. And the hope is that we'd hope that as lockdowns relax, this will organically happen. We see it very slightly happening, but most definitely some of the hits that they've taken, they do need support. The question remains, and I think it's super interesting, as you said, to look at what the conditional on operating, what their profits are looking like, because the question is, even if you provide them with support and they do manage to open these businesses again, will there be enough demand or not? And that remains a big concern. As well, what happens first in some sense, right? That is it that just organically as demand recovers, they may be able to find the capital to reopen these businesses, or other businesses may take that space. But definitely, there's reduced economic activity within these rural areas is what we're seeing.
Yeah, great, thanks. Boban, you wanted to ask something, I think.
Yes, no, I wanted to ask a question to Mahreen, because this is actually a very interesting work. So just to link it a bit to safety nets and social protection, and I think the point that Rossa just made around fiscal transfers now, but the question of, were there any kind of fiscal stimulus or fiscal transfers at that stage when this, in the aftermath? Because yeah, and I can come back.
No, not in Uganda. So we actually asked direct questions on if they'd received any support, because there was some food support, etc., that they were trying. Hardly any, less than 5% of the households reported in these rural areas that they received any support. So yes, I think this is worth maybe clarifying as well, that there are other countries who've done much more. And Uganda definitely seems to be the case. As far as, to my knowledge, that's true for a lot of sub-Saharan countries in rural settings. In urban settings, still there have been more programs and support. And I think part of it stemmed also from the initial hypothesis that rural areas will be relatively insulated, because the idea was that, they're just reliant on farm income, and so they'll be fine. They're not as dependent on markets. But which has proven to be at least partially true in this case. It's just that the upper tail is really struggling now, and looking still not like I mean, at one point I was like, okay, maybe it's narrowed the distribution, and so maybe it's okay in some sense, but the problem is that it's all moved leftward rather than in the direction we want. And because these households are still very poor, 40% of them still are below the poverty line. Even the business owning households, the ones that I was telling you are really, doing much better than the non-business owning households, they're still very, very poor households. So now they've all gone down to there's been a sharp increase in people living below poverty line in these areas.
Oh, it's been quite a sobering session in a few ways, I think.
Yeah.
Boban, I had a couple of questions for you actually about your methodology, if that's okay. So So I understood like how you are kind of using previous surveys and then extrapolating to understand the current distributions of income or wealth. And then the bit I was less clear on was like, how do you then kind of simulate the effects of the shock? So it's a two-part question. Can you explain that a little bit? And then do you have plans to test your methodology kind of backwards looking? I think this was your very last bullet point. You said it's possible to test this. And I was wondering if in your case you can test this.
Yeah, so the way we, and thanks Rossa, so the way we kind of simulated the shock was basically the 2020, the same method, but extrapolating it to the 2020 sectoral GDP growth data on these same households. So, and then kind of seeing, who was most affected. And I see a lot of, and to kind of respond to your second question, we don't have plans to go back and do this. But the work that Mahreen just presented is actually very linked, right, in a way, because when you kind of think of it in terms of time, right, we were at the beginning of this, and we kind of, and we did have this debate of well, the urban areas and like the better off seem to be more affected. Why should we have a social cash transfer program that targets the bottom 15 or 20%? But at that time, the conversation kind of revolved around what exists and how quickly can you get things up and running. On the other hand, we had a similar experience in Malawi where we, the safety net program expanded, and like they basically set up a new safety net program in urban areas, which never existed before that. And the actual transfers took about 7 or 8 months to actually materialize. By then it is still helpful for those households, but then, you kind of still have situation where people kind of sell off their assets, take children out of school or whatever. I mean, in this case, schools were shut anyway. But this is, I mean, it's a typical kind of, it's a blind spot in a way, right? These shocks kind of expose blind spots that you don't kind of look at very seriously, like urban safety nets or safety nets for the vulnerable, which kind of who will kind of fall into poverty when things hit. So so it's pretty sobering in that sense. And we do hope we can do some. I mean, let's see. I mean, if possible, we would love to kind of go back and check what we can to test out this method and see if it worked, or how well it worked.
Cool, thanks a lot, Boban. And without wanting to end on a pessimistic note, I'm afraid the session is now at time. So yeah, this has been quite a sobering session. I think it seems like there's still a lot to grapple with from a policy perspective in dealing with the kind of aftermath of COVID. But thanks so much. These are 4 great papers and really shining a light on some of the issues that we need to tackle collectively. So yeah, thanks very much, everyone who joined the session. Thanks to our presenters. You can give a virtual round of applause if you'd like, and I hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you.